My name is Robert Sterling, and I'm the governor of North Carolina. If you've ever wondered what it's like to have everything the world considers success, power, influence, a mansion with security details, but still feel like a complete failure as a human being, then you'll understand this story. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I was checking my campaign emails on a Tuesday morning when I saw it. Subject line: Wedding Update, please read. From claire.sterling.official@gmail.com. My daughter Claire. I almost deleted it, thinking it was another one of her political science research requests or maybe asking for a reference letter. Claire was always the practical one, the planner, the daughter who had her life mapped out since she was 12 years old. I opened it while my chief of staff was briefing me about the upcoming education reform bill. The first line made my coffee taste like acid. Dad, I've decided it would be best if you didn't attend my wedding. You can watch the live stream if you'd like. I know how much you value appearances, so this way you won't have to explain to anyone why your own daughter looks uncomfortable around you. I stared at that screen until the words blurred. 23 years of being her father, and she was uninviting me from the most important day of her life, via email. Like I was some problematic vendor being dropped from a contract. But here's the thing about being a politician: you learn to compartmentalize faster than most people learn to breathe. So I closed the laptop, nodded at whatever my chief of staff was saying about teacher salary increases, and pretended that email hadn't just rearranged every assumption I had about my relationship with my daughter. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent the last 8 years being called the people's governor, the guy who fought for working families, who never forgot his roots. Campaign ads showed me at kitchen tables, listening to single mothers talk about healthcare costs. Town halls where I rolled up my sleeves and promised to be the leader North Carolina deserved. But my own daughter had just fired me from the most basic job I'd ever had, being her dad. Let me back up and explain how we got here, because it didn't happen overnight. It was more like erosion. So gradual you don't notice until the foundation gives way completely. I married Margaret Chen when Claire was 4 years old. Claire's biological mother, Jennifer, had died in a car accident when Claire was barely 2. For those early years, it was just me and this tiny girl who had her mother's eyes and a stubborn streak that could outlast a North Carolina summer. We had our routines. Saturday morning pancakes that never turned out right. Bedtime stories where she'd correct my voices for all the characters. Dance recitals where I was the only dad in a room full of mothers, clapping too loud and taking too many pictures. Margaret was different from Jennifer in every way that mattered to me at the time. Where Jennifer had been spontaneous and artistic, a freelance graphic designer who painted watercolors in her spare time, Margaret was structured and ambitious. She worked in public relations, understood political strategy, and saw my potential before I did. When we met at a fundraiser for the local children's hospital, she was the one who suggested I run for city council. She was the one who mapped out a 20-year plan that would take me from municipal politics to the governor's mansion. You have the background for this, she'd say, reviewing my resume like she was crafting a campaign narrative. Small-town roots, military service, law degree from UNC. You understand both rural and urban issues. Plus, you're young enough to grow into the role but experienced enough to be taken seriously. Margaret wasn't wrong about any of that. She had a gift for seeing the bigger picture, for understanding how individual choices accumulated into career trajectories. What I didn't realize at the time was that she was also reshaping our family dynamic to fit her vision of what a political family should look like. The changes started small. Claire's art supplies gradually disappeared from the common areas of our house. We need to maintain a certain image, Margaret would explain when potential donors or party officials visited. Children's messes don't photograph well. Claire's finger paintings were replaced with professionally framed artwork. Her dress-up clothes were reorganized into a closet in the basement. The piano she'd been learning to play was moved to the back room because Margaret said the sound carried too much during phone interviews. Margaret enrolled Claire in private school, which meant longer days and more structured activities. Ballet replaced the tumbling classes Claire loved because ballet was more refined. Mandarin lessons were added because Margaret believed multilingual children had advantages in global politics. Claire's schedule became a careful balance of activities that would look impressive in future campaign literature. "We're investing in her future," Margaret would say when I occasionally questioned whether 6-year-old Claire needed quite so many structured activities. Successful families require intentional planning. I was busy building my own career and genuinely grateful for Margaret's organizational skills. Running for city council while maintaining a law practice meant 14-hour days and weekend campaign events. Margaret handled the logistics of our household with the same efficiency she brought to organizing fundraisers. Meals were planned, schedules were coordinated, and our family operated like a well-managed campaign office. But somewhere in all that efficiency, Claire started to fade into the background of our own home. So. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment when I consciously decided to prioritize politics over parenting. It was more like a series of small choices that seemed reasonable at the time. Missing her school play because I had a city council meeting that might determine the municipal budget. Cutting short our Saturday morning pancake tradition because I had early campaign strategy sessions. Letting Margaret handle parent-teacher conferences because she was better at asking the right questions and following up on academic plans. Margaret stepped into the parental role with the same systematic approach she brought to everything else. She hired tutors to help Claire excel academically. She arranged playdates with children from other politically connected families. She made sure Claire had every advantage: private school, summer camps, travel opportunities that could contribute to a well-rounded upbringing. What I failed to notice was that Claire had stopped talking to me about anything that mattered. Bidi. She was 8 when I won my first election to the state legislature. The victory party was held at our house, and I remember seeing Claire sitting on the stairs in her pajamas, watching the celebration like she was observing strangers. When I went to carry her to bed, she was polite but distant, as if I were a family friend rather than her father. "Dad, are you going to be gone more now?" she asked as I tucked her in. "Maybe a little more," I admitted. "But it's important work. I'm trying to help make things better for families like ours." She nodded solemnly. "Margaret says important people have to make sacrifices." That should have been a warning sign. The fact that my 8-year-old daughter was quoting my wife's political philosophy instead of asking me to read her another story or complaining that she'd miss me. But I was exhausted from months of campaigning and already thinking about the legislative session ahead. I kissed her forehead and told her I loved her, and she said she loved me too, but it felt rehearsed somehow. The next few years blurred together in a succession of legislative sessions, committee hearings, and incremental political victories. Margaret's strategic planning proved effective. I built a reputation as a pragmatic moderate who could work across party lines. Rural voters appreciated my farming background, while urban constituents respected my education policy initiatives. When the opportunity arose to run for lieutenant governor, I had the coalition and fundraising network to mount a credible campaign. Claire was 12 during that election cycle, old enough to understand that our family was constantly being evaluated by strangers. She learned to smile for campaign photographers, to shake hands with donors at fundraising events, and to answer reporters' questions about her favorite subjects in school. Margaret coached her on appropriate responses to personal questions, reminding her that anything she said could be quoted in newspapers or repeated on social media. "Remember, you represent more than just yourself," Margaret would tell her before public events. "People are watching to see what kind of family we are." Claire adapted to the political spotlight with an ease that impressed everyone who met her. She was articulate, poised, and photogenic, exactly what a political daughter should be. Campaign consultants praised her natural charisma. Party officials commented on how mature and well-behaved she was compared to other politicians' children. But at home, she had become increasingly self-contained. She did her homework without being asked, kept her room immaculate, and never created the kind of normal childhood chaos that might disrupt Margaret's carefully maintained household order. She stopped asking me for help with school projects or inviting me to her extracurricular activities. When I asked about her day, she gave polite, efficient summaries that contained no real emotion or detail. Ishins pege jotis. I told myself this was normal adolescent development. Teenagers were supposed to become more independent. to start forming their own identities separate from their parents. Margaret agreed, pointing out that Claire was thriving academically and socially, showing none of the behavioral problems that might indicate underlying issues. What I didn't see was that Claire had learned to navigate our family the same way she navigated political events, by presenting a carefully managed version of herself that wouldn't cause problems or require too much attention. The lieutenant governor's mansion came with its own set of expectations and obligations. More security, more scrutiny, more events where Claire's presence was expected but her actual thoughts and feelings were irrelevant. She attended state dinners and charity galas, always dressed appropriately and capable of making small talk with donors' children or foreign dignitaries' families. Margaret was in her element, organizing our social calendar with the precision of a military operation. Guest lists were vetted, seating arrangements were strategic, and every event was an opportunity to strengthen political alliances or build support for future campaigns. Claire turned 16 the same month I announced my gubernatorial campaign. Her birthday party was held at the mansion, and the guest list included the children of major donors, party officials, and potential running mates. Professional photographers captured every moment for future campaign use. The cake was custom designed to match our family's political color scheme. I gave a toast that night, talking about how proud I was to be Claire's father, how impressed I was by her maturity and intelligence, how excited I was to see what she would accomplish in life. The guests applauded, Margaret beamed, and Claire smiled at exactly the right moments. Later, when I was helping clean up, I found her in the kitchen by herself, scraping leftover cake into the garbage disposal. "Good party," I said, trying to sound casual. "Yes," she replied without looking up. "Margaret did an excellent job with the planning. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Did you have fun?" She paused, considering the question like it required careful analysis. It was appropriate for the occasion. That phrase, appropriate for the occasion, stuck with me for weeks afterward. It sounded like something Margaret might say when evaluating a campaign event, not how a 16-year-old should describe her own birthday party. But the gubernatorial campaign was entering its final stretch, and I was consumed with debate preparation, fundraising deadlines, and the constant travel required to reach voters across the state. Margaret managed our household like a campaign headquarters, ensuring that everything ran smoothly despite my chaotic schedule. Claire had her own commitments: student government, debate team, volunteer work with carefully selected nonprofit organizations that aligned with our political brand. She was building the kind of resume that would guarantee admission to any college she chose, developing the leadership skills and public service experience that could position her for her own political career if she decided to follow that path. On paper, everything was perfect. We were a successful political family with bright futures and strong values. Campaign literature featured photos of us at church, at community events, at the dining room table allegedly discussing policy issues over family dinner. The reality was that we had become strangers who shared the same address and campaign calendar. I won the gubernatorial election by a comfortable margin, and Claire was a poised and gracious presence at the inauguration ceremony. 18 years old, she had been accepted to Georgetown University with plans to major in international relations. The local newspapers ran features about the next generation of political leadership, speculating about whether Claire Sterling might follow in her father's footsteps. She moved to Washington for college that fall, and I realized with something approaching panic that I had no idea who my daughter really was beneath the polished political persona she had cultivated throughout her adolescence. Our phone calls were infrequent and superficial. She updated me on her academic progress, her internship with a congressional subcommittee, her plans for studying abroad junior year. I shared highlights from legislative sessions, updates on policy initiatives, stories about interesting people I'd met at various events. We talked like professional colleagues who happened to share a last name. During her sophomore year, she started dating Marcus Thompson, a pre-med student whose father worked for the State Department. Margaret approved of the match, noting that Marcus came from the right kind of family and had the sort of background that could complement Claire's potential political future. I met Marcus twice during Claire's college years, once at a parents' weekend and once during Christmas break. He was intelligent, ambitious, and appropriately deferential when discussing policy issues with me. He and Claire seemed genuinely fond of each other, sharing inside jokes and academic interests that I could observe but not really understand. Claire graduated summa cum laude and moved to New York for a graduate program in international affairs. Her thesis on diplomatic relations in Southeast Asia was published in a respected policy journal. She spent summers interning with think tanks and nonprofit organizations, building the kind of experience that could lead to careers in foreign service, academia, or eventually elected office. Marcus completed medical school and secured a residency at a prestigious hospital in Boston. Their relationship had survived the demands of graduate school and professional training, and when Marcus proposed during Claire's final semester, I learned about the engagement through a formal announcement they sent to both sets of parents. Margaret immediately began planning what she described as a wedding that would reflect our family's values and social position. Venue selection, guest list development, media management. She approached the event like a state dinner with romantic overtones. That's when Claire sent the email asking me not to attend. Sitting in my office that Tuesday morning, reading her words about live streams and uncomfortable appearances, I finally understood that somewhere along the way, I had lost my daughter completely. Not to tragedy or conflict or any dramatic breaking point, but to the slow, steady erosion of a relationship I had taken for granted while building everything else I thought mattered. The most successful man in North Carolina had just been fired from the only job that actually mattered, and I had no idea how to begin fixing what I had spent 23 years breaking. That email sat in my inbox like a loaded weapon for 3 days. I'd open it, reread Claire's words, then close the laptop and pretend I had more pressing gubernatorial matters to handle. Infrastructure budgets, healthcare legislation, education reform. Anything except facing the fact that my own daughter had just demoted me from father to unwelcome spectator. Margaret found me in my home office Thursday evening, staring at campaign photos from my lieutenant governor days. Pictures of our family at ribbon cuttings, charity events, political rallies. In every single photo, Claire looked perfect, poised, smiling, appropriately dressed. But now, looking at them with fresh eyes, I could see something I'd missed before. In every image, there was distance in her posture. She stood next to me, not with me, close enough for the cameras, far enough to maintain her own space. "You've been distracted all week," Margaret said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk. "The Education Committee is expecting your input on the charter school proposal, and you haven't returned Senator Morrison's calls about the infrastructure bill." I turned my laptop screen toward her. Claire's email was still open. Margaret read it silently, her expression shifting from confusion to calculation. When she finished, she leaned back and folded her hands in that careful way she did when processing political complications. "This is obviously some kind of pre-wedding stress reaction," she said finally. Claire's always been dramatic about emotional situations. Remember when she threatened to skip the inauguration because she didn't like the dress we'd chosen for her? I didn't remember that. In fact, I couldn't recall Claire ever being dramatic about anything. If anything, she'd always been unnaturally accommodating, agreeing to whatever plans Margaret made for family events. "She specifically mentions feeling uncomfortable around me," I said. "That's not pre-wedding nerves, that's something deeper." Margaret stood and walked to the window overlooking the mansion's south lawn. Even at home, she moved with the measured grace of someone always aware they might be photographed. "Robert, you're reading too much into this. Claire's marrying a medical resident. Marcus probably has limited time off, so they're keeping the wedding small and intimate. She's trying to spare you the awkwardness of declining the invitation because of your schedule." She didn't ask about my schedule. She told me not to come. Semantics. Margaret turned back to me with that smile she used during difficult press conferences. "I'll call her tomorrow and smooth this over. We can frame your absence as supporting her desire for a private ceremony, very modern and respectful of the bride's wishes." The casual way she said "your absence," as if missing my daughter's wedding was already a foregone conclusion, made something cold settle in my stomach. "I don't want my absence framed as anything," I said. "I want to understand why my daughter doesn't want me there." Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Sometimes understanding requires accepting that other people's decisions aren't always logical. Claire's been independent since college. She's probably trying to establish boundaries as she transitions into marriage. That word, boundaries, echoed in my head long after Margaret left my office. Boundaries suggested that I had been crossing lines, overstepping in ways that made Claire uncomfortable. But how could I be overstepping when I barely existed in her life anymore? I spent that night scrolling through my phone, looking for recent photos of Claire and me together. Campaign events, yes. Official functions where we stood side by side for photographers. But personal moments? Father-daughter time that wasn't choreographed for public consumption? I had to scroll back 3 years to find a single picture of just the two of us, and even that was at a political fundraiser. Friday morning, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I cleared my schedule for the afternoon and drove to Chapel Hill without telling anyone where I was going. The University of North Carolina campus held layers of memory for me. I met Jennifer here when we were both undergraduates. This was where Claire had been conceived, where I'd proposed to her mother, where I'd walked across the stage to receive my law degree while Jennifer cheered from the audience with 6-month-old Claire in her arms. I parked near the student union and walked the same paths I'd taken 25 years earlier. Students hurried between classes, backpacks slung over shoulders, talking on phones or laughing with friends. Normal college life, unencumbered by political considerations or carefully managed public images. I found myself thinking about the conversations I'd had with Jennifer during our college years. Late-night discussions about our futures, our dreams, our fears about becoming adults in an uncertain world. Jennifer had wanted to travel, to freelance for international magazines, to raise children who understood art and music and different cultures. She'd been skeptical of my early political ambitions, worried that public life would consume everything genuine and spontaneous in our relationship. Politicians become performers, she'd said during one of our last real arguments. They get so used to saying what people want to hear that they forget how to say what they actually mean. At the time, I'd dismissed her concerns as artistic temperament. Politics was about public service, about making meaningful change in people's lives. The performance aspects were just necessary tools for achieving larger goals. But sitting on a bench outside the journalism building where Jennifer had spent so many hours working on the campus newspaper, I wondered if she'd been more perceptive than I'd given her credit for. Had I become so accustomed to performing the role of devoted father and family man that I'd lost track of the actual relationships those performances were supposed to represent? My phone buzzed with text messages from my chief of staff, reminders about Monday's budget meetings, and requests for comments on various policy proposals. The machinery of government continued operating whether I was engaged or not, a reality that should have been reassuring but instead felt oddly hollow. I drove back to Raleigh as the sun was setting, taking back roads through small towns where my name appeared on yard signs and bumper stickers. Governor Sterling, trusted leadership for North Carolina families. The irony of that campaign slogan had never been sharper. Margaret was waiting for me in the kitchen when I got home, dinner plated and warming in the oven. She'd prepared salmon with roasted vegetables, the kind of healthy, photogenic meal that had appeared in countless lifestyle articles about our family's commitment to wellness and work-life balance. I spoke with Claire this afternoon, she said as I sat down. Just as I suspected, this whole email situation is much simpler than you're making it. She and Marcus are planning a very small ceremony, immediate family only. She's concerned about media attention and wants to keep things private. I cut into the salmon, watching steam rise from the pink flesh. What did she say when you asked her about feeling uncomfortable around me? Margaret paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. I didn't bring up specific phrases from the email. That would have been confrontational. I focused on positive solutions and affirmed our support for whatever makes her happiest. So you didn't actually address the problem. I addressed the situation in a way that preserves everyone's dignity. Margaret's voice carried the patient tone she used when explaining political strategy to junior staff members. Claire is managing a lot of stress right now. The last thing she needs is additional pressure from us about guest list decisions. I set down my fork and looked directly at my wife. When did you last have a real conversation with Claire? Not about wedding planning or career decisions, but about what she actually thinks and feels. Margaret blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. We talk regularly. She called last week to discuss the catering menu, And before that, we discussed her graduate school thesis defense. She's very focused on her academic and professional development. That's not what I asked. Robert, I think you're creating unnecessary drama where none exists. Claire is a capable adult making reasonable decisions about her wedding. Our job as parents is to support her choices, not interrogate her emotional state. But I was beginning to understand that somewhere along the way, our parenting had become entirely reactive. We supported Claire's choices because she had learned to make only choices that required no real response from us. She had become so skilled at managing herself and anticipating our expectations that we never had to engage with who she actually was beneath all that competence. Saturday morning, I did something else I hadn't done in years. I called Claire directly, not through Margaret's careful coordination or formal scheduling. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice cautious. "Dad, is everything okay?" The fact that she assumed something must be wrong for me to call her unannounced told me everything I needed to know about the state of our relationship. "I got your email," I said simply. Silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken years of careful distance and polite avoidance. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," she said finally. "I just thought it would be easier for everyone if we kept things simple." Easier? How? Another pause. I could hear traffic in the background, probably New York City sounds filtering through her apartment windows. "Dad, we don't really know each other anymore. Not in any way that matters. Having you at my wedding would feel like performance art, smiling for cameras and pretending we have the kind of relationship that we don't actually have." Her words were devastating in their matter-of-fact delivery. No anger, no accusation, just clinical assessment of our family dynamic. "When did that happen?" I asked. "When did we stop knowing each other?" Claire laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't think we ever knew each other." "Not really. I learned very early to be the kind of daughter who wouldn't cause problems for your career. Quiet, accomplished, photogenic when necessary. It worked for everyone. It didn't work for me if it meant losing you." "Dad, you didn't lose me. You never had me. Not in the way fathers and daughters are supposed to belong to each other." The line went quiet again. I could hear her breathing, could imagine her standing in whatever apartment she'd made for herself in New York, surrounded by a life I knew nothing about. "I used to watch other kids with their parents," she continued, her voice softer now. "At school events or soccer games. I'd see dads who knew their daughter's favorite colors, or who understood their inside jokes, or who got genuinely excited about their hobbies. I realized I didn't have that with you. We had campaign events and photo opportunities and dinner table discussions about current events, but we never had connection." I pressed the phone closer to my ear as if proximity could bridge the gap that years of distance had created. "I want to have that," I said. "I want to know your favorite color." "It's green," she said quietly. "Forest green, like the trees behind Mom's studio in the old house. I've loved that color since I was little, but somehow it never came up in any of our conversations." Jennifer's art studio. I had forgotten that Claire would have been old enough to remember that space, to associate colors and emotions with her mother's creative work. How many other memories and preferences had I missed because I was too busy managing the public version of our family? "Claire, I know I've made mistakes." "Dad, this isn't about mistakes. This is about the fact that Margaret has been more of a parent to me than you have. She made decisions about my education, my activities, my social life. She taught me how to present myself in public, how to handle media attention, how to navigate political events. You were just present. Physically there, but emotionally unavailable." The accuracy of her assessment hit me like cold water. Margaret had indeed managed the practical aspects of Claire's upbringing with remarkable efficiency. I had been grateful for that organization, that systematic approach to child-rearing that freed me to focus on political responsibilities. But efficiency wasn't the same as love, and management wasn't the same as connection. "I don't want to watch my wedding on a live stream because you feel obligated to attend," Claire said. "I want to marry Marcus surrounded by people who actually know me, who chose to be involved in my life rather than just performing the role of involved family." How do I become someone who actually knows you? The question hung between us for a long moment. "I don't know if that's possible anymore," she said finally. "We're both different people than we were when I was a kid. I'm not sure there's enough foundation left to build on." After she hung up, I sat in my home office for hours, staring at the phone and trying to process what felt like the complete collapse of every assumption I'd held about my role as Claire's father. Margaret found me there Sunday morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes, surrounded by photo albums I'd pulled from storage sometime during the night. "You're going to make yourself sick obsessing over this," she said, gathering up the scattered pictures. "Claire will come around. She always does when she's had time to think rationally." But looking at those photos, years of carefully staged family moments, I was beginning to understand that rationality might be exactly the problem. Claire had spent her entire life being rational, accommodating, perfectly managed. She had learned to need nothing from me because I had never taught her that needing things from parents was acceptable. Margaret was still talking, outlining strategies for repairing relationships and managing public perception. But her words felt distant and inadequate. Political solutions for what was fundamentally a human failure. For the first time in my career, I was facing a problem that couldn't be solved with better messaging or strategic positioning. My daughter didn't want me at her wedding because I had never given her a reason to want me anywhere. And I was finally beginning to understand that this wasn't something Margaret could manage for me. Monday morning arrived with the usual avalanche of gubernatorial responsibilities, but I couldn't focus on budget allocations or policy briefings. Claire's words from our phone conversation echoed in my head. "Margaret has been more of a parent to me than you have." That observation had been delivered without malice, just factual precision that cut deeper than any accusation. I found myself studying Margaret differently during our morning meeting about the healthcare initiative. She moved through the agenda with her characteristic efficiency, discussing polling numbers and stakeholder meetings with the same systematic approach she'd used to raise my daughter. Everything color-coded, cross-referenced, strategically planned. "The pharmaceutical lobby wants a private meeting before we announce the prescription drug pricing reforms," she was saying. But I was thinking about Claire's comment that she'd learned to be the kind of daughter who wouldn't cause problems for your career. When did that happen? When did my 4-year-old girl, who used to demand bedtime stories and sticky pancake kisses, transform into someone who calculated her behavior based on political implications? "Robert, are you listening?" Margaret's voice snapped me back to the present. "The pharmaceutical meeting," I said. "Schedule it for Thursday." Margaret made a note, then looked at me with the same assessing expression she'd worn when reading Claire's email. "You're still dwelling on this wedding situation. I understand it's disappointing, but you need to compartmentalize. The transportation bill requires your attention this week, and Senator Hayes is expecting your position on the environmental regulations. Compartmentalize." That word had defined my political career, and apparently my parenting. Keep everything in separate boxes so that inconvenient emotions wouldn't interfere with necessary functions. But Claire hadn't been an inconvenient emotion. She'd been my daughter, and somehow I'd filed her away like a policy brief that could be addressed later when time permitted. After Margaret left, I did something unprecedented. I canceled my afternoon appointments and drove to Charlotte unannounced. I needed to talk to someone who had known Claire before politics consumed our family dynamic. Eleanor Hartwell lived in a modest ranch house near the university, where she'd taught elementary education for 37 years. She'd been Claire's kindergarten teacher, then remained a family friend long after Claire had moved on to other grades. Eleanor was one of the few people who remembered Jennifer, who had known our family during the brief period when we'd been more than a political unit. Eleanor answered the door wearing gardening gloves and a surprised smile. "Robert Sterling, what brings the governor to my doorstep?" "I need to ask you about Claire," I said simply. Her expression shifted, becoming more cautious. "Is everything all right?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Eleanor led me to her kitchen, where she made coffee in a pot that looked older than my political career. No staff, no security detail, no agenda. Just two people having a conversation in a room that smelled like cinnamon and honesty. "When did you last see Claire?" I asked. "Christmas 2 years ago," Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from me. She was home from graduate school and stopped by with a book she thought I'd enjoy. We talked for about 2 hours. 2 hours. I tried to remember the last time I'd had a 2-hour conversation with Claire about anything other than her academic achievements or career plans. What did you talk about? Eleanor smiled, but there was sadness in it. She asked about her mother, wanted to know stories about Jennifer that she might not have heard before. I told her about the time Jennifer painted a mural in my classroom, how the children used to gather around her during volunteer reading sessions. I felt a familiar twist in my chest. Claire had been hungry for information about Jennifer, and she'd sought it from someone else because I'd never offered those stories myself. She also asked about you, Eleanor continued. Specifically, she wanted to know what you were like before politics. I told her about the young lawyer who used to coach Little League on weekends, who knew every child's name and batting average. I coached a Little League, I said, surprised by the memory, for 3 seasons, before I ran for city council. Claire didn't know that. She said you'd never mentioned sports or talked about coaching anything. The coffee tasted bitter. Another piece of my history that had been erased when I'd streamlined my identity for political consumption. Young fathers who coached children's sports didn't fit the serious professional image Margaret had crafted for my campaigns. Did she seem? I struggled to find the right words. Did she seem like she missed having a father? Eleanor set down her mug and studied my face carefully. Robert, Claire seemed like a young woman who had learned very early to expect very little from the adults in her life. Not because they were cruel or neglectful, but because they were too busy with important things to notice what she actually needed. What did she need? The same thing every child needs. To be seen as a complete person, rather than a reflection of their parents' success. To have someone interested in her thoughts and feelings rather than just her achievements. To know that she mattered for who she was, not what she accomplished. Eleanor's words settled into my consciousness like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that disturbed everything I'd assumed about my role as Claire's father. She told me something that day that has stayed with me, Eleanor continued. She said she'd never learned how to be disappointing to people because no one had ever loved her enough to be disappointed. They were proud when she succeeded and absent when she struggled, so she just learned never to struggle. Never learned to be disappointing. The phrase created a new understanding of Claire's perpetual competence, her refusal to need anything from anyone. She hadn't been naturally gifted at independence. She'd been trained into it by parents who were too distracted to handle dependence. I drove back to Raleigh in silence, taking back roads through counties I'd campaigned in, past billboards featuring my own face promising accountability and responsive leadership. The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. That evening, I sat in my study and opened a notebook, actual paper, not digital files or staff memos. I started writing down everything I could remember about Claire, from different periods of her life. 4 years old. Loved finger painting, sang songs about dinosaurs, cried when thunderstorms woke her up. 8 years old. Played soccer until Margaret enrolled her in ballet, collected rocks from our driveway, asked questions about everything. 12 years old. This was where my memories became hazier. I remembered campaign photos, school awards ceremonies, public events where she'd stood beside me wearing appropriate clothes and answering reporters' questions politely. But personal moments? Conversations about her fears or dreams or daily experiences? The notebook pages remained largely blank. 16 years old. Academic excellence, student government positions, volunteer work with organizations Margaret had selected for their political value. But what music did Claire listen to? What books did she read for pleasure? What made her laugh or cry or lose sleep at night? I realized with growing horror that I had no idea. Margaret found me there near midnight, surrounded by photo albums and timeline attempts. "This obsession isn't healthy," she said, gathering up the scattered materials. "You're creating problems where none exist." Claire is a successful adult who's making her own decisions about her wedding. Our job is to respect those decisions, not psychoanalyze them. "When did she stop telling us things?" I asked. "What things?" "Personal things. When did she stop coming to us with problems or excitement or anything that mattered to her?" Margaret sighed with the patience of someone explaining obvious realities to a slow student. Children naturally become more private as they mature. It's developmentally appropriate for teenagers to confide in peers rather than parents. Claire has always been remarkably self-sufficient. Self-sufficient or abandoned? Robert, that's dramatic and unhelpful. We provided Claire with every advantage: excellent education, cultural opportunities, international travel. She never wanted for anything. Except for parents who knew her favorite color. Margaret paused in her organizing. What? She told me yesterday that her favorite color is forest green, like the trees behind Jennifer's art studio. I never knew that. In 18 years of being her father, I never learned something as basic as her favorite color. Colors are hardly significant in the context of successful parenting. But they were significant. I was beginning to understand. Colors and songs and fears and dreams. All the small details that accumulated into knowing someone completely. I had missed all of it, delegated the intimacy of fatherhood to a woman who approached relationships like campaign management. The next morning, I did something that sent my staff into a mild panic. I drove to Jennifer's grave. I hadn't visited the cemetery in over 5 years. Margaret handled the annual flower arrangements and memorial donations, keeping Jennifer's memory appropriately maintained without requiring my emotional participation. The headstone was simple: Jennifer Claire Sterling, beloved wife and mother, followed by dates that represented a life cut impossibly short. Someone had left fresh flowers recently, white daisies mixed with greenery. Forest green ribbons tied the arrangement together. Claire had been here. Recently, based on the condition of the flowers. Benjamin. I sat on the grass beside Jennifer's grave and tried to imagine the conversation Claire might have had during her visit. What did she tell her mother about her upcoming wedding? Did she express regret about excluding me, or relief? Did she seek Jennifer's guidance about navigating family relationships that had never quite formed properly? I think I messed up, I said aloud, feeling foolish but continuing anyway, with Claire. I let Margaret manage everything, and somewhere along the way, I forgot to be her father. The cemetery was quiet, except for wind moving through oak trees that had grown significantly since Jennifer's funeral. Birds called to each other from branches overhead, completely unconcerned with human politics or family dysfunction. She's getting married and she doesn't want me there, I continued. She says we don't know each other, and she's right. I can tell you her GPA and her graduate school thesis topic, but I don't know what makes her happy or what keeps her awake at night. A groundskeeper was working several rows away, trimming hedges with methodical precision. Normal work, uncomplicated by the weight of relationship failures or missed opportunities. I remember when she was little, before Margaret, she used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. You'd hold her while I made up stories about brave princesses who weren't afraid of anything. When did I stop being the person she came to when she was scared? The question hung in the air without answer, but sitting there among the grave markers and flowering trees, I began to understand that the answer mattered less than what I was going to do next. I couldn't change the years of emotional absence or undo the damage of treating fatherhood like a part-time political appointment. But Claire's wedding was still 3 weeks away, and perhaps there was time to at least try becoming the kind of person she might want in her life. Not because I deserved a second chance, but because she deserved a father who finally understood what he'd lost and was willing to work for what remained. Driving away from Jennifer's grave, I made a decision that would have horrified my chief of staff. I wasn't going back to the mansion. Instead, I pulled into a coffee shop in a strip mall 20 minutes outside Raleigh, ordered a black coffee from a teenager who had no idea who I was, and called my office. Cancel everything for the rest of the week, I told Linda, my longtime assistant. Sir, you have the transportation committee hearing tomorrow, and the education budget. Reschedule it all. Tell them it's a family emergency. There was a pause. Linda had worked for me since my lieutenant governor days and had never heard me use family as a reason to avoid political responsibilities. Is everything all right with Mrs. Sterling? Mrs. Sterling is fine. It's my daughter who needs my attention. I hung up before Linda could ask follow-up questions that I wasn't ready to answer. Then I did something I hadn't done since college. I drove without a destination, letting instinct guide me through small towns and rural highways until I found myself in Asheville, 3 hours from home. Asheville had been Jennifer's favorite city. She'd dragged me there countless times during our marriage, insisting that the mountain air and artistic community would keep us grounded despite my growing political ambitions. We'd walked through galleries, attended bluegrass festivals, and talked about dreams that seemed possible when we were young and naive, about how power changes people. I checked into a hotel under my real name, not bothering with the security protocols that usually accompanied gubernatorial travel. No advance team, no itinerary, no handlers. Just a middle-aged man trying to understand how he'd lost his way so completely. The first thing I did was something I should have done years ago. I started researching my own daughter. Not through Margaret's carefully maintained family files or political archives, but through the digital footprints that revealed who Claire had become when no one was watching. Social media accounts I'd never bothered to look at, academic publications she'd written, interviews she'd given for various nonprofit organizations. What I discovered was a young woman whose intelligence and compassion far exceeded anything I'd understood about her character. Her graduate thesis wasn't just academically impressive, it was deeply personal, exploring how American foreign policy affected refugee families, particularly children who'd lost parents to conflict or displacement. She'd spent a summer volunteering at a refugee resettlement center in Buffalo, working with families navigating immigration bureaucracy and cultural adjustment. Her supervisor had written a recommendation letter that painted a picture of someone who connected genuinely with traumatized children, who stayed late to help families complete paperwork, who learned basic phrases in 4 different languages to make newcomers feel welcomed. This was my daughter, not the poised political asset I'd seen at campaign events, but a woman who chose to spend her free time helping people who had nothing to offer her in return. I found articles she'd written for policy journals, op-eds about immigration reform that were thoughtful and nuanced, avoiding the partisan talking points that dominated most political discourse. Her writing voice was clear and passionate, advocating for policies that treated refugees as complete human beings rather than abstract policy problems. In one piece she'd written, "We cannot address humanitarian crises through bureaucratic efficiency alone. Trauma requires relationship. Healing demands connection, and policy solutions mean nothing without human compassion." Reading those words, written by the daughter I'd apparently never known, I felt something break open in my chest. Claire had dedicated her career to everything I'd failed to provide her: genuine attention, emotional connection, the kind of care that saw people as complex individuals rather than manageable variables. She had become what I had failed to be, and she'd done it despite my parenting, not because of it. I spent the evening in my hotel room, scrolling through her social media posts, seeing glimpses of a life I'd been completely excluded from. Photos with Marcus at a farmer's market, both of them laughing at something off camera. Pictures from her graduation, where she was surrounded by friends I'd never met. Images from hiking trips, art museums, concerts, all the experiences that made up an actual life rather than a political resume. In one post, she'd shared a photo of a painted mural featuring children from different cultures playing together. The caption read, "Working with refugee families reminds me daily that home isn't a place. It's the feeling of being truly seen and accepted for who you are. Being truly seen." The phrase echoed everything Eleanor had told me about Claire's need to be known as a complete person, rather than a reflection of parental success. I closed the laptop and stared at the hotel room ceiling, trying to process the magnitude of my failure. I'd been so focused on providing Claire with opportunities and advantages that I'd never bothered to discover what she was passionate about, what drove her choices, what she valued beyond academic achievement. The next morning, I drove to a bookstore in downtown Asheville and bought every book Claire had mentioned in her social media posts or academic citations. Fiction by authors I'd never heard of, policy analysis on refugee issues, memoirs about family dysfunction and healing. I wanted to understand what shaped her thinking, what resonated with her intellectually and emotionally. One book in particular caught my attention, "The Body Keeps the Score," about how trauma affects development and relationships. Claire had posted a quote from it months earlier. "Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives." Safe connections. I realized with growing clarity that I had never provided Claire with emotional safety, not because I'd been cruel or abusive, but because I'd been unpredictable in my availability, inconsistent in my attention, more focused on managing her behavior than understanding her experience. Margaret had provided structure and efficiency. But structure wasn't the same as safety. Efficiency wasn't the same as connection. I spent 2 days reading in coffee shops and mountain overlooks, trying to educate myself about the daughter I'd apparently never bothered to know. With each page, each article, each glimpse into her intellectual and emotional world, I understood more clearly why she'd uninvited me from her wedding. I wasn't just an absent father. I was a stranger who happened to share her DNA and political identity. On Thursday evening, I called Marcus. His number was listed in Claire's emergency contacts from graduate school, information I'd accessed through connections rather than because she'd ever shared it with me directly. He answered cautiously, clearly surprised to hear from the governor of North Carolina. "Mr. Sterling? Is Claire okay?" The immediate concern in his voice told me something important about their relationship. He protected her, worried about her welfare, responded to potential threats with genuine alarm. "Claire's fine," I said quickly. "I was hoping to talk with you about something." "About the wedding?" "About my daughter." There was a long pause. Marcus was probably wondering why the governor was calling to discuss personal family matters with someone he'd met exactly twice. "I realize this might seem strange," I continued, "but I'm trying to understand Claire better, to learn about who she's become as an adult. You know her in ways that I apparently don't." Another pause then. "Sir, I'm not sure this is my place. Please, I'm not asking you to betray confidences or share anything inappropriate. I just want to understand what makes her happy, what she cares about, what kind of person she is when she's not performing for political cameras." Marcus was quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. "She's the kindest person I've ever met," he said finally. "Not in a performative way, but genuinely. She notices when people are struggling and finds ways to help without making them feel diminished. She remembers details about everyone's lives, coworkers' children's names, classmates' family situations, neighbors' health problems." I listened to Marcus describe someone I should have known intimately, but had somehow missed completely. "She works with refugee families not because it looks good on her resume, but because she believes everyone deserves to feel welcomed somewhere. She stays late to help people navigate systems that weren't designed for them. She learns their languages, remembers their children's birthdays, celebrates their small victories like they're her own family." Family. The word hit differently coming from someone who'd observed Claire's capacity for connection from the outside. "She's also incredibly private about her past," Marcus continued. "It took me months to get her to talk about growing up in a political family. She said it was like living in a museum, everything carefully preserved and displayed, but nothing you could actually touch or change. Living in a museum. The metaphor was painfully accurate. "Does she ever talk about me?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Marcus hesitated. "She says you're a good governor, that you genuinely care about policy issues and try to help people through legislation. But, she talks about you like you're a public figure she respects rather than a father she knows. Like she's proud of your work, but doesn't expect personal connection." The assessment was devastating and accurate. I had become a stranger to my own daughter, someone she observed from a distance and evaluated professionally rather than loved personally. "Marcus, can I ask you something else? Why doesn't she want me at the wedding?" He was quiet again, clearly weighing how honest to be with a man who could probably ruin his medical career with a few phone calls. "She said having you there would feel like inviting a celebrity who happened to share her last name. Someone who would smile for photos and make appropriate comments but wouldn't really be present for the actual moment. She wants her wedding to be about genuine relationships, people who chose to love her, rather than people who were assigned to her by birth." Assigned to her by birth? As if I'd never made the conscious choice to be her father, to invest in knowing and loving her as an individual. Which, I was beginning to understand, I hadn't. "She also said," Marcus continued carefully, "that she didn't want to spend her wedding day pretending you were the kind of father who would naturally be included in something so personal." After Marcus hung up, I sat in my hotel room and cried for the first time since Jennifer's funeral. Not the careful, controlled grief of a public figure managing loss, but the raw, ugly crying of someone finally confronting the full scope of their failures. I had spent Claire's entire life treating fatherhood like a part-time consulting job, showing up for major presentations but leaving the daily work to someone else. I had been present for photo opportunities, but absent for the countless small moments that actually build relationships. And now my daughter was marrying someone who saw her completely, who knew her favorite books and private fears and professional passions, while I sat in a hotel room learning about her through Google searches and secondhand observations. The worst part wasn't that I'd failed as a father. The worst part was that I'd failed so completely that I hadn't even noticed until she'd been forced to exclude me from the most important day of her life. But sitting there in that anonymous hotel room, 3 hours from the political machinery that had consumed my attention for decades, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I was going to try to earn the right to know my daughter, even if it meant starting over completely. I returned to Raleigh Friday afternoon with a trunk full of books and a plan that my staff would have considered political suicide. I was going to New York to see Claire, unannounced and without Margaret's strategic input or damage control preparation. My security detail was less than thrilled when I informed them of my weekend travel plans. Spontaneous trips to see family members didn't allow for proper advance work or threat assessments. But I was done living my entire life according to security protocols and political calculations. Margaret was in her study when I got home, surrounded by wedding planning materials that she'd apparently been working on, despite Claire's explicit request for distance. Venue comparisons, catering options, guest list drafts, all the elements of a political event disguised as a family celebration. "You can't just disappear for 3 days without explanation," she said, without looking up from her color-coordinated planning folders. "The lieutenant governor had to handle the transportation committee hearing, and Senator Hayes is asking questions about your commitment to the environmental package." I sat down across from her, noticing for the first time how her planning approach treated Claire's wedding like a campaign event requiring strategic management rather than a personal celebration requiring emotional investment. "Did you know Claire works with refugee families?" I asked. Margaret glanced up, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Of course. It's an excellent experience for someone interested in international relations. Very marketable for future diplomatic positions." Marketable? Robert? Nonprofit work demonstrates commitment to public service without the partisan baggage of electoral politics. Claire's building exactly the kind of resume that could lead to appointments in future administrations. I stared at my wife, finally understanding that she had never seen Claire's humanitarian work as evidence of her character or values. It was just another strategic career move, like the private school selections and extracurricular activities that had shaped Claire's childhood. "She speaks 4 languages because she wanted to communicate with the families she helps," I said. "Not because multilingual skills look good on government applications." Margaret returned to her planning materials. Quote, "The motivations are less important than the outcomes. Claire's positioned herself excellently for whatever career path she chooses." That phrase, "positioned herself," revealed everything wrong with how we'd approached parenting. We'd spent 18 years helping Claire position herself for success rather than simply loving her for who she was. "I'm driving to New York tomorrow," I announced. "Why?" "The wedding isn't for 2 weeks, and we haven't finalized our response to her guest list preferences." "There is no our response, Margaret. Claire doesn't want me at her wedding, and I need to understand why that happened." Margaret set down her pen and looked at me with the patient expression she used when explaining obvious realities to junior staff members. "It happened because Claire is managing wedding stress and trying to keep things simple. Our job is to respect her decision and maintain family dignity. Our job was to be parents who knew our daughter well enough that she would want us at her wedding." I left Margaret in her study and spent the evening packing for a trip that violated every principle of political risk management I'd learned over the past decade. No advance team, no prepared talking points, no exit strategy if the conversation went badly. Just a father trying to understand why his daughter had given up on him entirely. Saturday morning I drove to New York alone, refusing a security escort and taking back roads through Virginia and Pennsylvania. The 6-hour drive gave me time to think about everything I'd learned during my research week, everything Marcus had told me about Claire's character, everything Eleanor had revealed about my failures as a parent. By the time I reached Manhattan, I had no clearer idea of what to say to Claire, but I was certain that staying away was no longer an option. I found her apartment building in the Upper West Side, a modest brownstone that housed graduate students and young professionals. No doorman, no security system, just a simple intercom and mailboxes listing residents by last initial. C. Sterling, apartment 4B. I stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes, watching people walk past with their dogs and coffee, and Saturday afternoon errands. Normal lives, uncomplicated by political obligations or family dysfunction. I envied their simplicity. Finally, I pressed the button for 4B. Hello? Claire's voice through the intercom sounded cautious. Claire, it's your father. Silence. Then, Dad, what are you doing here? I was hoping we could talk. Another pause. I'm not sure what there is to say that we haven't already covered. There's a lot I never said that maybe I should have. The intercom went quiet for so long, I thought she'd decided not to respond. Then the building door buzzed open. Claire's apartment was small but comfortable, filled with books and art and photographs that told the story of a life I'd been excluded from. Pictures of her with Marcus, with graduate school friends, with the refugee family she'd worked with in Buffalo. A corkboard covered with thank you notes written in different languages, children's drawings, academic conference programs. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking younger and more relaxed than she ever appeared in political contexts. This was Claire in her natural environment, and I realized I'd never seen her this way before. You want coffee? She asked, moving toward a small kitchen that barely qualified as a galley. Sure. We sat at a table by the window, overlooking the street, where I'd stood gathering courage to press her intercom button. The silence between us felt different than it had during our phone conversation. Less hostile, but somehow more final. I've been reading your articles, I said finally. She looked up from her coffee mug. Which articles? All of them. Your thesis, the op-eds about immigration policy, the pieces about refugee resettlement. I spent the week learning about the work you do. Claire studied my face like she was trying to determine whether this was genuine interest or political research. And I realized I've never known what you care about. What drives your choices? What you're passionate about? What keeps you up at night thinking about problems you want to solve? Most parents learn those things gradually, over the course of their children's lives, she said quietly. Not through Google searches after their kids uninvite them from major life events. The accuracy of her observations stung, but I didn't deflect or defend. You're right. I should have been paying attention all along. Claire set down her mug and looked directly at me. Dad, I'm not angry with you. That's what you don't understand. Anger requires expectation, and I learned a long time ago not to expect emotional availability from you. What do you feel toward me? She considered the question carefully. Disappointment, maybe. The same way you'd feel about a teacher who had potential but never lived up to it. I wish you'd been different, but I don't hate you for being who you are. Her calm assessment was more devastating than anger would have been. Anger suggested I still mattered enough to generate strong emotions. Disappointment suggested I'd been relegated to the category of minor life disappointments, like bad weather or canceled plans. I talked to Marcus, I said. Claire's expression sharpened. About what? About you. About who you are when you're not performing for political cameras. He described someone I should have known intimately, but apparently never met. Marcus sees me because he chooses to pay attention. You see me because you're biologically obligated to acknowledge my existence. The distinction hit like cold water. Choice versus obligation. Investment versus duty. I want to choose to know you, I said. I know it's 20 years too late, and I know you have every right to say no, but I want to try to become the kind of father you might actually want in your life. Claire leaned back in her chair, studying me with the same careful analysis she probably applied to policy problems at work. What does that look like to you? Trying to become a different kind of father? I don't know, I admitted. I've been thinking about it for a week, and I still don't have a clear plan. But I know it means learning who you actually are instead of just being proud of your achievements. It means caring about your thoughts and feelings instead of just your career trajectory. And what about Margaret? What about your political obligations? What about all the reasons you've been absent for the past 2 decades? The questions were fair and pointed. Claire had learned to think strategically about family relationships, because that's how our household had operated her entire life. I don't know how to balance everything, I said. But I'm starting to think that trying to balance everything has been the problem. Maybe some things deserve more priority than others. Claire stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street where normal families were probably having normal Saturday conversations about ordinary problems. Dad, I want to believe you're serious about this. But I've spent my whole life watching you prioritize everything else over personal relationships. Margaret manages our family like a political operation, and you let her because it's easier than actually engaging with messy emotional realities. She turned back to me. Even now, sitting in my apartment, talking about wanting to know me better. Part of me wonders if this is just damage control. If you're here because my uninviting you from the wedding creates political problems rather than because you actually miss having a relationship with me. The question forced me to examine my own motivations with uncomfortable honesty. Was I here because I genuinely wanted to repair our relationship, or because her rejection threatened my identity as a successful family man? Both, I said finally. I came here because your emails scared me politically and personally. But sitting here now, seeing your apartment, seeing who you've become without my input, I think the personal fear is bigger than the political one. What are you afraid of? That I've already lost you completely. That there's nothing left to build on, no foundation that survived all the years of me treating you like a political asset rather than a daughter. Claire returned to her seat and looked at me for a long moment. There isn't much foundation left, she said quietly. But maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe starting over is better than trying to repair something that was never built properly in the first place. Starting over, I repeated. What would that look like? Claire pulled out a photo album showing pictures of her with Marcus's family. Casual dinners, holiday gatherings where everyone looked genuinely relaxed. This is what normal families look like, she said. Marcus's parents know my favorite foods, my pet peeves, what makes me laugh. They remember work stories and ask follow-up questions weeks later. I studied the photos. Claire looked different, less guarded, more animated. His dad tells terrible jokes, she explained. Genuinely awful puns that make everyone groan. But he keeps trying because making people laugh is his way of showing love. Such a simple concept, yet I couldn't remember ever trying to make Claire laugh just for joy. When was the last time you asked me something personal? Claire continued. Not about my career, but what I'm reading for fun, or how I'm feeling about anything. I couldn't remember. Not recently, maybe not ever. During sophomore year at Georgetown, I had a panic attack during finals week, Claire said. I called home crying, barely able to breathe. Margaret started talking about stress management techniques. You got on for 30 seconds to tell me I was smart enough to handle it, then handed the phone back to Margaret. The memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. I'd been preparing for a budget hearing and treated Claire's crisis like an interruption requiring efficient resolution. What did you need me to say? I asked. I needed you to ask what was scaring me, to listen while I explained that I felt like a fraud at Georgetown. I needed you to tell me about a time when you felt overwhelmed and how you got through it. She closed the album. Instead, you treated my panic attack like a political crisis requiring containment rather than a human moment requiring connection. There's something else, Claire said. Marcus proposed 6 months ago. We've been engaged for half a year, and you found out through an email 3 weeks before the ceremony. 6 months. They'd been planning a life together for 6 months before I learned about it. We talked about whether to tell you right away, Claire continued. Marcus wanted to call with the news. Maybe invite you to dinner to celebrate. But I knew Margaret would take over, turn the engagement into a strategic opportunity rather than personal celebration. She was right. Margaret was probably already creating guest lists, despite Claire's explicit request for distance. So we planned everything ourselves, Claire said. People who actually know us and care about our relationship rather than what it represents. And I don't qualify as someone who knows you. Dad, if you knew me, really knew me, you would have been among the first people I wanted to share that news with. I finally understood the full scope of what I'd lost. Not just her wedding, but her engagement joy, all the small moments that should have connected us. I want to try to build something real with you, I said. An actual father-daughter connection. She studied my face. What does that mean practically? You can't just decide to be different because you finally realized what you've been missing. I don't know what it means practically, I admitted. But I know it means your life becomes more important than my career. If I could change everything, I continued, what would you have needed from me? Claire smiled sadly. I would have needed you to choose me sometimes. Not over everything, but sometimes. I needed to know that I mattered enough to be prioritized occasionally. You matter now. Now is 20 years too late for a lot of things. But maybe it's not too late for other things. For the first time, I saw something that might have been hope. If you're serious about this, I won't be managed or scheduled or treated like a political problem. Either you want to know me as a complete person, or you don't. What do I need to do? Go home and figure out whether you're actually ready to change, or whether you just want to feel better about being the kind of father who gets uninvited from his daughter's wedding. The drive back to Raleigh felt endless. Claire's question echoed in my mind. Was I ready to actually change? Or did I just want to feel better about my failures? I arrived home to find Margaret surrounded by wedding planning materials despite Claire's explicit request for distance. Vendor lists, seating charts, the machinery of a political event disguised as family celebration. How did it go? She asked without looking up. She's been engaged for 6 months, Margaret. 6 months. Margaret paused. Young people prefer handling things independently. It's quite mature. That response crystallized everything wrong. Margaret treated Claire's exclusion as competence, rather than recognizing it as indictment of our emotional unavailability. She doesn't want us there because we don't actually know her, I said. We've provided Claire with every advantage. Excellent education, political connections for her career. But we don't know what makes her laugh or keeps her awake at night. Margaret looked up. Knowing your favorite colors isn't successful parenting. Claire is accomplished and independent. She learned independence because we were too busy to be dependable. I made a decision that felt terrifying and necessary. I'm resigning as governor. Margaret stared. What? I'm finishing this term and not running for re-election. I want to build a real relationship with Claire. You're having an emotional reaction to wedding stress? You don't restructure your career because of temporary family drama. This is 20 years of me being absent while convincing myself career success was good fathering. Margaret gathered materials with sharp movements. You're throwing away everything we built. The influence, the platform. What's the point of helping other families if I can't show up for my own? She looked at me coldly. You'll be known as the governor who quit for personal reasons. Your legacy will be a failure. Maybe that's appropriate. Margaret left without another word. 2 weeks later, I announced my resignation. The press speculated about the scandal. None guessed the truth. I'd realized being a successful politician meant nothing if I was a failed father. Claire's wedding was Saturday. I didn't attend, but I watched the live stream, not as a politician calculating appearances, but as a father learning who his daughter had become. She was radiant, surrounded by people who loved her completely. Marcus's family welcomed her, like she'd always belonged. Friends gave speeches about her kindness, her refugee work, her ability to make everyone feel valued. I watched my daughter marry someone who knew her favorite books, her fears and dreams. Someone who had earned the right to be there. HBD. After the ceremony, I texted, "You looked beautiful. I'm proud of the woman you've become." She responded, "Thank you. Maybe we can have coffee when I get back from my honeymoon." Not forgiveness, but possibility. 6 months later, Claire and I meet monthly for lunch. I'm learning that her favorite author is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. That she volunteers at a community garden. That she and Marcus are considering adoption. Claire and I meet easy pun. Being Claire's father is more rewarding than being governor ever was. Margaret and I divorced quietly. I practice immigration law now, connecting to issues Claire cares about. People ask if I regret giving up political power for family relationships. The question assumes those were equal choices. Casual, hashol badi tal mimora. They weren't. One was performance, the other was love. And love is always worth choosing, even when it comes 20 years too late. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.